Welcome to the Pillar Podcast, a ministry of Pillar Seminary for contextual leadership. Our goal is to equip listeners to become better readers of Scripture and more skillful leaders in their local churches and ministries. If you would like to learn more about Pillar Seminary and sign up to receive exclusive content from Pillar's faculty, please visit pillarseminary.org.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pillar Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a real treat in store for you. We have begun our foray into Christian nationalism with a podcast where we introduce the topic, defined the topic, and then teased a whole bunch of interviews. And this is the first such interview that we have here. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here. I will tell everybody who you are in just a minute, but thank you so much for your presence here with us.
I'm delighted to be with you guys today.
And with me as well is Dr. Moore, Donnell, and he has instructed Elizabeth to call him DJ. So if we hear a DJ, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about Dr. Moore, yeah. And then we have as well Daniel Cabral. Thanks for being here, buddy.
Hey.
Okay, so I will say before we really get into this, Elizabeth, this is real coup for us. You have been interviewed by all the cable news, all the national news, all the media outlets, and now the Pillar Podcast. I don't think I'm smart enough to be as terrified as I should be about this interview. This rarefied air here that we're breathing.
I strongly disagree because the most exciting conversations I have are always with fellow believers who are interested in doing something about the problem. So this is such a joy for me to be able to join you.
Excellent. Yeah, well, yeah, we're delighted you're here. Let me read your bio here and let you fill in the gaps for us if there are things that we need to know before we really get going. Okay, so this is going to melt the brains of our audience. Elizabeth, you're a counterterrorism and homeland security professional who served on the Homeland Security Council staff in the George Bush administration starting in 2003. During the Trump administration, you served as a senior advisor and deputy chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security. I'm laughing as I say this. This is insane. Kind of pinching myself. As the DHS Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy. So between the Bush and Trump administrations, you also worked as a senior advisor in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence as a contractor, helping businesses with cybersecurity and risk assessment with the DHS and developing threat assessments in restructuring and opening regional offices. You're also, as if that's not enough, the Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot, which is a really cool organization, a social enterprise working to end online harm and abuse. What did I miss in there? Are there some gaps you need to fill in here to help us understand a little more about who you are?
I'm a proud mom. I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old who are the delight of my life. And I'm also a wife to a wonderful husband who has made a lot of sacrifices for me to be able to serve in the way that I have in the last few years. I would say that's probably the center of my world. And then I also obviously am very pleased to be able to work in the field that I do. I work alongside amazing men and women who keep us safe every day. And that's probably the when you think about all of the work that you do over a career, it's not the policies, it's not the thing that a president announces, it's the people. And there are a lot of amazing people in this country that keep us safe every day. And I've had the privilege to work with them. So those are probably the other highlights.
Okay. Whew. Yeah, that's incredible. And one of your sons is homesick today, so
he is. Yeah.
if we need to hit pause and you got to go be a mom, that's great. We appreciate you being here. If you wouldn't mind, before we really dig into things, I found out about you at this conference that we talked about in the previous podcast, this Politics, Polarization, and Peacemaking Conference. And you were sharing from your area of expertise in counterterrorism. Could you, before we get to the book a little bit more, the book that's coming out that we're going to really engage in. Could you talk a bit about just give us a little back of the envelope there with your professional experience and how you got to where you are here, please?
Sure. I have spent 20 years working on counterterrorism, the domestic side of counterterrorism. So not the military, not the intelligence piece, but how do we have the systems in place within the United States to detect an attack, to protect against an attack, and to make sure that we can respond when a bad day occurs. I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, and I was very young, and it was very formative. It was just a moment that I think many my age who experienced it said, I will do whatever it takes so that we never have to go through this again. And that's just kind of been the thing that drives me ever since. And I think there are lots of ways that people can contribute to that mission of keeping us safe. It doesn't have to be through government service the way that I did, but that was the thing that was driving me. I noticed in coming back into government in 2017 that the threat had started to shift, and the intelligence community is very limited in how they can assess domestic threats. They're very good at overseas threats, but for a variety of legal reasons, they're prohibited from really looking domestically. So it's very much a law enforcement job, and law enforcement has some inhibitions into how they can assess things. So we started to see incidents, hate crimes increase. Probably one of the big moments was Charlottesville, where everybody was like, where did this come from? And we turned to our analysts in the government. What does this mean? Are we seeing a different type of trend emerging? And nobody could really give us good answers. And as the years passed, and I'm still in government, I feel like we got our questions answered, albeit after attacks. We saw more attacks in 2018, more attacks in 2019, really culminating in that El Paso Walmart attack in Texas. And that really, any lingering doubts that we had that the threat had shifted were resolved in that fateful Saturday. We definitely realized that the threat had not only shifted, but we were not well equipped as a country to deal with this threat because it was so different. And that kind of launched me on a journey, both within government and then when I left government in 2020, to better understand what had happened. How did we go from worrying about an external threat, planes flying into buildings, to being more concerned about our fellow Americans just picking up any weapon that they might have access to, largely guns, and walking into a public space and just taking lives. And what does that mean, and why is that happening? And I think 2020 for everyone was such a hard year. I think we're still trying to recover from it. We can go into more details about that here in a minute, but that 2020 moment, I happened to leave government in April and was doing the virtual learning stuff for my kids, and I was decompressing after 3 years of government service as a political appointee in a very chaotic administration. So I'm just trying to catch my breath, and I feel like I woke up from a deep sleep in June to a country on fire, and realized like whatever concern I had in 2019 about a lone offender attack, like in El Paso, it was almost like it had metastasized and amplified and just spread so rapidly and so quickly. And the thing that I found most disconcerting was that it was coming from what I consider to be my community. It was coming from predominantly white people who identify as conservatives and Christians, or at least there's actually a thread in certain types of extremist ideology where it's not so much Christian in a salvation context or a biblical knowledge context as much as it is Christian in heritage or identity. And they were co-opting our faith for the sake of their extremism. And it just kind of led me to this place of, do you remember post 9/11? For those in the audience that are old enough to remember, post 9/11, there was a lot of soul searching, and there was a lot of trying to understand what would cause a group of Muslims from halfway around the world to want to wreak such havoc. And one of the things that we asked American Muslims to do was to try to speak out against this kind of violence, that this is not what their scriptures taught. And there was this big pressure on the Muslim community to denounce. And I remember thinking, like, if that's what we were asking them to do, then shouldn't we as Christians, when we see our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, or perhaps they're not, but they're co-opting our religion, shouldn't we speak out against that just as much? Shouldn't we be drawing a very clear line of what our scriptures teach and denounce where that teaching or where those actions do not line up with that teaching? And so that kind of prompted me to go on this journey that has led me to be able to speak to congregations and pastors and lay leaders in churches to share from my vantage point, from my professional lens, why I'm so concerned about the state that our community is in, but hopefully also a message of hope. I think there are things the church can do, and these are not just hopeful, aspirational. We actually have evidence base. We have like a lot of good data from 20 years of counterterrorism to understand why people radicalize and what we can do to build protective factors, what we can do to help people disengage from radicalization. So there's a lot of knowledge that we can use in our community. And as I started really diving into that, it was one of those moments where you realize the Lord's hand in this. You start seeing these connections. You're like, well, of course, that's what Scripture teaches us. Like, of course, the evidence base is actually going to back up the wisdom of Scripture, what God has taught us all along. So that's kind of what led me to get to meet you a couple of months ago and to start to write this book.
Oh man, that's fantastic. So we should just get into the book then. Certainly the call to action is to pre-order this book. It is coming out next month. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In April. Yeah. So
April 23rd.
let's the title is Kingdom of Rage, the Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. And you can find a little preview of it on Amazon like we did and get all excited about it. You've already, though, kind of brought us into the conversation about this. I am curious if you could elaborate a little more on, I guess, the problem as you saw it before we get to this solution where we'll land here. So you mentioned this alliance between or co-opting of religious symbols. This is Christian nationalism, what we've been engaging with already in our podcast, this kind of co-opting of Christian symbols, but really bringing it into the service of right-wing extremism. Can you elaborate just a little more on what you've seen from your vantage point on that? Hey, let's take a break from the podcast. If you are considering studying with us and want a taste of the full Pillar experience, join us for a preview day. It's a live class and conversation with Pillar's faculty, president, and academic dean. You can learn about how to pay for seminary, and you can meet some of Pillar students and alumni. We'd love to see you there. Check out pillarseminary.org/preview to register for a free preview day experience. And you can get all your questions answered and any further details clarified emailing us at admissions@pillarseminary.org. Hope to see you there.
Yes. So one of the things that I think it's important to start with facts, because all of us participate in media echo chambers. Even if we try to read widely, we gravitate back towards the sources that we find comforting. And depending on where you live, depending on the news sources that you frequently go to, your perspective of what's wrong in the country is going to be a little different. I feel like facts help equalize us and put us on equal footing. So some of the facts to be aware of is that we have had more attacks and more plots from people motivated by ideology that is classified as right-wing violent extremism. I'll come back to that term in a second.
Okay.
We've had more attacks and plots from them than from people motivated by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And certainly, and to a much lesser extent, you see other types of ideological extremism, like left-wing violent extremism, which includes things like Antifa, anarchist violent extremist, environmental extremism. It is not that those extremists don't exist in our country. They do. They are just significantly smaller in number. The number of attacks is significantly smaller, and the types of attacks that they perpetrate are very different than the ideologies that are grouped over in that right-wing violent extremism category. The left-wing tend to be more focused on destruction of property, vandalism, disruption of services. So we're very concerned right now. There is an active effort by people that identify with that anarchist movement to disrupt critical infrastructure. So to try to make our power go out. So definitely causes harm, definitely something from a law enforcement perspective that we are concerned about and that we actively try to identify and disrupt. At the same time, anarchist violent extremists usually don't kill intentionally. If someone is killed in the process of an attack, it's usually an accident or it's melee, like a bar fight type situation where you have protest, counter protest type of fighting. So that is not to minimize that those extremists aren't causing harm to our society. They absolutely are. But it is a very different type of threat. And so the resources, if you're a policymaker and you're looking at where do I apply my resources, where do I make sure that and by the way, limited resources, the counterterrorism budgets and the law enforcement budgets in this country have been drastically reduced over the last 5 years. Different conversation, whether that's appropriate or not, but just it's the reality. If you're the person in charge of protecting your community, you have to make tough choices about where to apply your resources. So generally speaking, in the security community, we prioritize life over property. We try to protect it all, but we're always going to make the err on the side of we have to protect life, and then we protect the property. And so when you hear government officials talk about the greatest threat coming from these ideologies that are associated with right-wing violent extremism, they're not making a political statement. They're just making that risk assessment calculus of I'm going to save more lives because this threat on the right is posing more danger to people being killed or injured. Okay, so let me circle back to right-wing extremism.
Okay.
The academic community is allowed to use those terms. And if you go to Europe or you go to Canada or Australia, those are the terms they use. In the United States, the government does not use those terms because, as you can imagine, it riles people up. What do you mean? You're calling right-wing extremists? And that's not what they're saying. What they're trying to describe is there are violent extremists that hold different ideologies, and some ideologies align on the left side of the political spectrum, some align on the right of the political spectrum, some don't have any political ideological alignment, or might end up on both. So it's an academic way of grouping. It's not saying that the political right of this country is more violent than the political left. So I think that's an important distinction for all of us. I really think words are so important here because we banty about like extremism and radicalized, and like those actually have meanings for our community. And I get frustrated because the media often uses them too nonchalantly and without proper anchoring and definitions. So on the right, that category, the two primary areas of concern are what's titled racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists
Okay.
primarily white supremacist, violent extremists. So this is your neo-Nazi groups, your white power movements. There are actual groups that are active here in the United States. There are also many, many more unaffiliated, but participating in what I call the milieu of extremism, and that milieu is predominantly online. So the white supremacist extremist is one of the most lethal attackers. The other category is anti-government violent extremists. And in particular, this is where you have militia. And militia is another interesting one. Most militias are defensive in posture, meaning they're not antagonistic. They're not going out looking for a fight. They're preparing for a bad day. They might hold some conspiratorial beliefs that the government's going to come take their guns. The government's going to put them in a concentration camp. I live in Denver. One of the most famous conspiracy theories in Denver is that there are tunnels underneath Denver airport that are going to ship people to concentration camps. This started in the 1990s. It's still very prevalent. My husband works for the airport, so he gets to hear a lot about them. And he clarifies there are no tunnels, secret tunnels taking people away. So that's the nature of the type of conspiracies that somebody who joins a militia might be doing it for preparing for a bad day. Usually the conflict or the problem comes when law enforcement tries to intervene with them for some reason. As we saw, Ruby Ridge, Waco, some really great examples of law enforcement not handling the circumstances well, leading to loss of life. But there was no reason to believe, at least not on a massive scale, that those situations were going to result in some sort of proactive attack by those groups. However, there's a small subset of militia who are proactive, and that number has increased in the last 5 years. In fact, the last 2 to 3 years, and I was talking to a friend at the Department of Justice recently, and he says the trend is continuing this year. Most of the violent extremists that they have been encountering through cases, through indictments, are coming from that anti-government extremist mindset. That maybe not surprising post January 6th, post COVID-19. There's a lot of people really angry at the government right now. And so it created a permission structure perhaps for more to move into that vein, if you will. But the reason to spend time talking about these groups is not because you're most likely you don't know anybody in these groups. Kind of depends on where you live. If you live out west, you might be more likely to know some people. But most of us are not worried about our loved ones going to join a organized violent extremist group.
Yeah.
The problem is that in the last 10 years or so, partly due to social media, partly due to our politics, partly due to a number of uncertain events like COVID, but also, other things, just global disruptions and the way that we do our work, changes in our economy and how it's harder to get that secure job, right? Like there's a number of reasons why we are increasingly living through uncertain times. COVID was just this amplifier, this massive exacerbator of phenomenons that were already there. And anytime you have a great uncertainty, extremists thrive on that. Because an extremist mindset is very much about black and white thinking. There is something that went wrong in your life. You have a grievance. I have the reasons for that grievance. It's very black and white. There's very little nuance. And they create a scapegoat. They create an other that is to blame for your grievance.
Yep.
And part of that extremist process is not just creating an other, because I would say, and I think I said this, Dan, when we were in Phoenix, the extremism as a concept, the definition I use, it's when an in-group perceives that their success or survival is at risk from an out-group.
Yeah.
And if I just stop the definition right there, there's more to it. But if I stop there, that's our entire politics today, right?
Yep.
We are in and
Yep.
outgrouped, and the
Yep.
other side is posing a risk to our success or survival.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So like we're saturated in the mainstream in the precursor part of an extremist narrative. So here's the rest of the definition.
Oh.
The rest of the definition is, and therefore hostile action is necessary.
Yep.
Now,
Yeah.
if a politician says, and therefore you should vote for me, completely legitimate political speech that does not check the extremist box. Now, if I had a chance to talk to them, I'd say, could you please knock it off about the othering? That's not great. But it's not extremist. But if our politicians say, we might end up in civil war unless you vote for me, or this is going to be, a very dangerous set of circumstances if the election doesn't turn out my way. Then you're starting to create permission structures for people to think, hostile action might be necessary. And we do have mainstream politicians who are frequenting in that kind of language. And we've almost become dull to it. Like one of those mainstream politicians.
It's so common.
Once they've broken that barrier and they are persistent in talking that way, people just kind of are like, oh, it's no big deal. That's just how he talks. And you're like, that might be true for like 95% of Americans, but that is motivating for a very small subset who hear that. And then they go through a radicalization process of going, am I doing everything I need to do? I'm not doing enough. I should do more. And then they move themselves into a state of planning violence. So that's the concern that I have, is our community is like sitting and saturating in the early precursor narratives of extremism. And why people radicalize, it's fairly complex. There's not a linear path. There's not one single answer. But it doesn't help to take the entire population of the United States and have us constantly be in this precursor narrative stage. Because once the other factors start to tick in, whether it's maybe some sort of crisis has happened personally in your life, maybe you become friends with somebody that is involved with an extremist group. It could be a number of reasons why, but since you're already in that precursor stage, it's an easy step to go to that next stage. And that's my concern. That's why I wrote this book, is like we need to wake up as a community. It is not healthy for us to be living in a place where we're constantly outraged and we're constantly feeding our grievances. And, oh, by the way, not actually doing anything to address them in a healthy way. We have agency, and we also, as Christians, have, a whole tool set for how to deal with suffering, how to deal with grievance, and we're not putting that into practice.
You may or may not know that we exist entirely from two different revenue streams. One is tuition revenue, and the other is from donations from supporters, generous supporters like many of you. We could not do what we do, including this podcast, which is a ministry of Pillar Seminary, without your generous support. We would ask you to prayerfully consider, if you haven't already, joining us, partnering with us, and supporting the work and the ministry that we do here in all of its forms at Pillar Seminary. You can find out more, and you can go online to give at pillarseminary.org/give.
Thanks for listening to the Pillar Podcast, a ministry of Pillar Seminary for contextual leadership. Please visit us on the web at pillarseminary.org to find out more about our academic degree programs and non-credit learning opportunities. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and podcasting platforms. Thanks again for listening.